Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 18th of November, and I do apologize because this video will be brief. We're only looking at frontline updates, in particular the Andriivka and Chasiv Yar fronts. I really would like to look at the Russian missile strikes that occurred yesterday, consisting of 210 cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, drones. I'd also like to look at the news from the Biden administration, where they have now eased restrictions in relation to the 300-kilometer range ATACMS, allowing them to be utilized by the Ukrainians on certain targets deep within Russian territory. Although right now the ambiguity is as to whether they will be allowed to be utilized with the Ukrainians outside of Kursk Oblast, whether they'll be utilized in areas like Voronezh, Lipetsk, Rostov. There's so many potential areas that are within that 300-kilometer range from the line of contact, the border between Russia and Ukraine, and then Russian cities. I believe there are actually 245 well-known targets and 14 airfields that could be struck based on that number. But we don't know right now due to the ambiguity of the position and the reporting from the media about whether Biden has given Zelensky the green light to utilize them. And besides that fact, the stockpiles for ATACMS after a year of the Ukrainians using them on Crimea and, all of the Russian-controlled areas in pre-2022 Ukraine have really depleted their arsenal. And so even that has to be taken into account when we look at the magnitude of the effect. In any case, I want to show you guys the front line and begin by looking at the Andriivka front. So you can see here a marginal Russian advance south of Uspanivka as the Ukrainians from the 72nd, 79th, and 116th Brigades are working on creating this consolidated defense salient, I suppose you could say, which includes really important strongholds surrounding the entrances to the villages. So the Russians advanced along two routes recently along this particular highway and through Trudove. And the Ukrainians, for the time being, have been able to prevent direct entrances into Uspanivka, but the Russians are continuing with gains in Trudove, taking over much of the village, amounting to 1.64 kilometers of advances. Right now, they're only about, if I'm going to measure it, I want to see, about 1.9 kilometers away from the town center. And then the corridor between the line of contact to the north and south would be 5 kilometers. So the Ukrainians have a 5-kilometer corridor, which is important to secure the connectivity and potential escape route for the various Ukrainian soldiers, several battalions of soldiers that are holding in these villages along the Sukhyali River and then the fields slightly to the north. And that's mainly the responsibility of the 33rd Mechanized Brigade. So in this video, you have the Storm Z detachments, so penal battalions from the 68th Army Corps, and they stormed the houses in Trudove, dismounted from armored vehicles, and raised their flag over there. So keep an eye out for the developments. But the Ukrainians have moved in elements of the 37th Marine Brigade, which is also operating further to the north, more generally around the Kurakhove and Andriivka sectors. They have been moved, at least one of their battalions, to defend in the region northeast of Maksimivka. This is an area that has untapped potential for the Russian side, and that's why the Ukrainians are trying to preemptively ensure that the Russians don't maximize their gains here. This open field area on the line of contact is concerning because it's only several kilometers away from the Sukhyali River, and the Russians reaching that location will make it extremely difficult for the Ukrainians to, in an organized manner, retreat from the present salient that you see marked with this red rectangle. Because imagine how narrow the corridor would then become. It would really just be the area between the northern bank of the river and Dalnya. And that would be an area that the Russians could very easily concentrate fire through. And it's an area that lacks paved roads. It's all just open fields. Really, really dangerous. So that's one worry. The other worry is that the Russians could then advance along these open fields close to the Sukhyali River and reach the southern outskirts of Andriivka, areas like Ulakli, and really receive unfettered access to the highways connecting Andriivka to various other villages. And because there is no unified line of defense here, they would be able to actually infiltrate into the city center. That's a huge fear, and the way that the Ukrainians are going about preventing that is by moving in reinforcements. So they already have territorial defense elements like the 123rd Brigade and the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade, and now they're moving in the 37th Marine Brigade. At least one of its battalions is involved in the fighting here. So in this geolocation from November 17th, the unit, they sent an Oshkosh MATV armored vehicle to dismount troops in a trench that the Russians were probably present in, and were making inroads towards Sukhyali and Hikhant over here, really close to the riverbank, so they were able to reassert control and ensure that there is this buffer zone that really is important for the Ukrainian connectivity in this entire theater of operations. So that's one video. They also were involved in drone strikes targeting various Russian vehicles advancing along this highway towards Uspenivka. So that's the status quo around here right now. Further north around Dalnya, the Russian forces have been able to advance and take over most of the village. So this is a 0.8 square kilometer gain. This is based on footage from the Ukrainian side. I believe 33rd Mechanized Brigade. So they utilize a Leopard 2A4 and various FPVs to strike Russian soldiers and vehicles that were approaching and actually operated within Dalnya, making it as far west as the agricultural parts of the village. And the focal point of the fighting has been centered around Dalnya, and that means that the fighting becomes much more methodical and grinding. And as a result, the advances around fields and around trenches nearby have diminished. But now that the Russian forces are getting control over this populated area, it's going to mean they'll have a center of gravity through which to launch attacks in the future. So, first of all, that has huge implications for the salient to the south, because the Russians are very close to reaching this highway connecting Kurakhove to Uspenivka. And then, of course, we'll have the ability to utilize it. Besides that fact, they'll also be able to really infiltrate deep into the various trenches that are located south and west of Kurakhove, and of course have access through the paved road to Kurakhove itself from the center. So really, Dalny does unlock a lot of possibilities for the Russians in this really nearby zone of fighting. In addition, the Russians have advanced near the Vovcha River or the Vovcha Reservoir. You can see the extent of the advances amounting to 3.74 square kilometers. There are geolocations of grenades being dropped onto Russian soldiers around these various locations, these gullies, tree lines, local like inlets or outlets of rivers. Here you can see the Russians were able to enter into Beretsky and take over the entirety of Novo Ilinka. The full extent of the Russian advance would amount to 2.76 kilometers in width, and now the Russians are in the process of taking over the entirety of Beretsky. They still have to work on crossing over the rail line and its windbreaks and taking over most of the residential areas, along with some of the trenches that are surrounding its perimeter. And after that point, the only thing that would be left in this general rectangular salient would be open fields, really lacking density when it comes to trenches, but do have some tree lines. So the Russians have already been able to assert the status quo, or I suppose the front line, along this gully, and then the goal will be to expand it past that area. Also, you do have now preliminary reporting on the Russians advancing south of Vozisenko and probably doing that along the rail line, because there is a very perfect route along those windbreaks to continue advancing southwards. And the Ukrainian resistance levels in these areas are relatively low due to the need to withdraw westwards for consolidation and focus on repelling Russian advances near Sonsivka. Now, to look at the Pokrovsk front, you can see here, again, large-scale Russian advances. To the north, the Russians have taken full control over Petrivka and Hrihorivka. 5.6 square kilometers taken in the process based on reporting from the Ukrainian side. And also this geolocation here. This is from November 18th. It's from the Puma drone group. They dropped a grenade onto Russian soldiers north of Petrivka. And again, that does showcase a wide variety of casualties. And that's a part of the Russians really pushing the Overton window forward, because they had just been able to secure these two villages and were already in the process of trying to reach the E50 highway. So that was a part of the thinking, trying to, get on the front foot and put additional pressure along this 5-kilometer area before reaching the defense line around Chenske and Zelene. But for now, Ukrainian drone crews are trying to push back those Russian soldiers, and mainly doing so not through ground-to-ground encounters, but through drones that are tracking them. Also, a bit to the northeast, you have this Russian advance, 6.6 square kilometers. This is, again, the Russians taking advantage of the Ukrainian withdrawal from populated areas along this rail line and advancing northwards towards the third to last defense ring surrounding Pokrovsk and also pretty close to Mirnorod. And this means that everything in between those hinterlands are going to be exposed, because the Ukrainians do still have a lot of drones in the skies, a lot of grenades being dropped. There's a huge amount of various units that are involved in these operations, very small, decentralized Ukrainian drone units involved here. But then the Russian forces on foot, they're going to be able to push through in tree lines and in open fields. and there isn't a large density of trenches here. The real test really comes with the trenches located a bit to the north, about 5 kilometers north. And those trenches are so important because they have not been fully completed. They are still, relatively intricate, not completely connected though. And we have to see how they withstand Russian attacks along certain areas, like near highways, near rail lines that could be utilized for deep advances, and near certain villages. So now the Russians are really in the process of preparing for, infiltration attempts through the southern flank of Pokrovsk. And more generally, in the months ahead, this is going to be one of the key routes through which the Russians exert pressure onto the Ukrainian side, in addition to the attacks from the eastern flank. So there's going to be, these two vectors throughout the entire course of the battle and for its suburbs. And, 68th Brigade, 1st Battalion, is really involved with the Ukrainian defensive efforts. There are initial reports on Russian attempts to storm Pustinka, but nothing confirmed as of yet. So just keep an eye out for that. In addition, we have here the Ukrainians conducting a localized counterattack, taking back this piece of territory. This is important because the 425th Skala Battalion, they are an assault unit that has specialty in taking back territory, especially on a small level, with a concentrated assault with Bradleys or M1000 117s, and they dismounted forces in the trenches and took them back. So this is a key trench that is just south of Mykolaiivka. And the fact that the Ukrainians here have been able to ensure a very strong foothold near this sort of like squarish area, this quadrilateral, it shows that they have a strong presence and an ability to retain control over territory, including this landfill, this trench, and everything around this rail line. The fact that they've been able to do this has ensured that the Russians can't in turn use the rail line to advance deep into the outskirts of Murad and Pokrovsk in a similar fashion in which they did for an area like Novohordivka. So that's been very, very important. Now, to look at Chasiv Yar, here we can see two things. So first off, the Ukrainians are conducting their own localized counterattacks to push the Russians out of many of their holdings west of the Donbass Canal. A lot of this is just the natural, manifestation of Russian excesses being caught out in the Ukrainians organizing their own counterattacks when the Russians weren't completely focused on this area. So the Ukrainians in total, during the solidification process, have taken back 6.3 square kilometers. This includes quarries, mine number 9, as it is referred to, a lot of positions along the H32 highway. And this is crucial for two reasons. First of all, it ensures that the Russians don't have any depth further south in this open area, which leads to Bilahora, Delivka, and more generally the outskirts of Toretsk. And also the connection, the route that you have to go through from Konstantinivka to Toretsk, because this area is really crucial. There are a lot of key defense nodes here, a lot of logistics hubs, and more generally, there could have been a Russian exploitation across the canal through these open areas to reach all of those locations that are 15, 20 kilometers away from the front line right now. So for the time being, the Ukrainians have ensured that that possibility is put to rest. But on a more local level, there's also always been the threat of the Russian forces seeping into the southern outskirts of Chasiv Yar through the canal axis, through the highway, and then pushing into forested areas, into mines, and then making their way into actual residential buildings, into forested regions, into ponds, and then into the center of Chasiv Yar. And so for now, that has been repelled. So the southern flank is important because it has diverted Ukrainian attention away from just defending the center of the city. But they've also been able to successfully push back the Russians to a certain degree, albeit the Russians are still present west of the canal to a certain degree. You can see that in the rectangle. On the other hand, the Russian forces are having success because they have continued advancing through the center of Chasiv Yar. So they have near complete control over the Oktyabersky district in eastern Chasiv Yar over here. There's also the Zhvotnevi district in the western portion of this entire complex, if you would refer to it as that. It's a sort of like segregated area of Chasiv Yar located a bit to the east of the city center. So those two districts are largely under Russian control, with some exceptions, because a lot of these areas are very difficult to retain control over due to the intensity of urban warfare. A lot of drones are present in the skies. A lot of ruins and basements have to be cleared out. So I can't say that for certain, but it looks like the Russians have been able to advance through this area and establish a permanent, or I suppose temporary, deployment points near the city center near the Avanhrad Stadium. This was on November 18th. The Ukrainian Air Force, they had a JDAM strike they conducted onto the Russian concentration in central Chasiv Yar. I believe 2 missiles were utilized, and it does indicate that the Russians, even after a couple of days, have been able to retain control in this particular region, which I would say speaks to the strength of the route leading to it, further indicating that the Russians do have a solid, foothold in those areas. But I won't say it's complete just yet. You also have to look at what's going on with the Novi district, because it appears now to be sort of isolated, because it's really just surrounded by these various forests that the RGs are going to feast upon. And then to the north, you have the Russian holdings, and to the east, you also have Russian control near the canal. So this is an opportunity for the Russians to get control over an additional district of the city, and to also utilize the wide array of, very, very important trees over here, forested areas. I believe it is a deciduous forest. And from there, to undermine the center of Chasiv Yar, which includes the city hospital, a local school, refractory number 3, which some Russian sources are reporting is currently being fought over. So there are Russian attempts to infiltrate in, but I'm not sure about that, because I would assume that, going head on into some of these factories and areas that are really well prepared by the Ukrainian side is not something that they would do initially in the first phases of the intense clashes within the urban center. In any case, you do have a lot of apartment complexes here with, very good views of the entire battlefield, and more generally being on huge elevation. So the Russians taking this part over would give them some local domination, not completely, because the Ukrainians have their own heights further back on the rear, but it would give them a good organizing point to then push further deep to Mykolaiivka and further to the north to this northwestern section of the city. The Ukrainian defense here is consisting of the 23rd, the 24th Mechanized Brigade also, and 24th Brigade, I believe, is involved in some of the counterattacks further south in the Canal region, but I can't be sure about that. 56th Brigade, they're one of the key units fighting in the urban battle. Further to the south, you have the Assault Regiment Berlingo. It's really involved as well. Further to the south, you have, I believe, the 241st Territorial Defense Brigade. Not a lot of information has been published about them recently, but last we saw from them, they were operating here. 5th Assault Brigade, they're really invested in the Canal region, so their manpower is extremely useful. They're doing that in collaboration with the 93rd Brigade, which has had some of its elements, battalions, moved away from the Chasiv Yar area to defend in Pokrovsk, but the Signum drone unit of the brigade is still operating here. And you also have the IDAR, I believe, separate assault battalion, in addition to artillery support from the 26th Artillery Brigade and a few other units. So that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.